I count things. That's the first thing you should know about me, because it's the thing that started all of it, though I didn't understand that yet. Not on the night this really begins, not for a long time after. I count doors before I walk into a room. I count the beats between lightning and thunder even when there's no storm, just out of habit, just because my brain likes to know how far away the danger is. I count the seconds it takes my mother to answer a question she doesn't want to answer. And I have learned over 18 years that anything past 4 seconds means she's deciding how much of the truth I can survive. I counted the knocks on my window that night. 3. Always 3, a rhythm so familiar I could have played it back with my eyes closed. Knuckle, 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 a half-second apart, soft enough that my parents never heard it from down the hall. I slid the window up before I even looked, because some part of me already knew the shape of the shadow standing in the dark of our backyard, knew it the way you know your own heartbeat without having to check. "You're going to get caught one of these nights," I whispered, and Eli climbed through with the easy quiet of someone who had done this so many times his body no longer needed to think about it. One hand braced on the sill, one boot finding the exact spot on my desk chair that wouldn't creak. "I never get caught," he said, and smiled at me in the dark, and I felt it low in my stomach the way I always did, an ache that had no good name. "I want to tell you that nothing was wrong that night. That would be a lie, but it would be the kind of lie I was telling myself for a long time. So let me tell it to you the way I told it to myself, and you can watch it come apart the way I watched it come apart, one small thread at a time. Here is what I knew in October of my senior year. My name is Wren Calloway. I am 18 years old. I am, according to every teacher who has ever filled out a recommendation letter for me, exceptionally perceptive and unusually attuned to detail, which is a polite way of saying I notice things other people let slide past them, and I have never once figured out how to turn that off. I solve the crossword in pen. I keep a voice memo app on my phone that I talk into at night when my thoughts move faster than my hands, a habit my therapist calls externalizing, which is a word for something that used to just be called talking to yourself in the dark. And I loved a boy named Eli Marsh, who climbed through my window 3 times a week and always knocked 3 times first, and who had a way of looking at me like I was a puzzle he had already solved and still couldn't stop looking at. Here is what I did not know, not yet, though I would spend the rest of that year finding out one splinter at a time. There is a 14-month hole in my memory, right where an accident used to be. Nobody has told me that word, accident, more than a handful of times, and always in the same careful tone people use when they're handing you something breakable. I know there was a car. I know there was ice on the road outside town, the kind that doesn't announce itself, the kind that looks like wet asphalt until your tires find out otherwise. I know I woke up in a hospital bed in March of last year with a concussion and a rib that ached when I laughed and absolutely no memory of the 6 months before it. And slowly in pieces, most of it came back, my sophomore year, my friends, the way my mother took her coffee, the exact color of my locker. Most of it came back, not all of it. There is still a door in my head that doesn't open, a stretch of that spring I cannot reach no matter how hard I press against it, and everyone around me has gotten so good at stepping around that door that I stopped noticing they were doing it. My mother touches the frame of it sometimes, glancing, careful. She'll start a sentence with "before the accident, you used to," and then just stop, redirect, ask if I want more coffee. My father does the same thing with his eyes, a flicker toward me and away, like checking that a wound is still closed. I used to think that was normal. I used to think that was just what grief looked like from the outside, walked around like a hole in a floor everyone's memorized the shape of. Eli never did that. Eli was the only person in my life who never went quiet around the edges of what I didn't remember. He filled it in for me instead, told me stories about us that spring, easy and specific, the two of us skipping econ to sit on the water tower hill, the two of us splitting a milkshake at the place on Route 9 that closed down in August, the two of us slow dancing badly in his kitchen to a song his older brother used to play. He was the bridge across the part of my life I couldn't cross on my own, and I loved him for it with a gratitude so total it took me months to notice it had a strange, thin edge to it, like a coin that's real on one side and doesn't quite finish on the other. That October night, he sat backward on my desk chair with his arms folded over the top of it and watched me finish my calc homework, the way he always did, patient in a way that 17-year-old boys are not supposed to be patient. And I looked up at him and noticed, the way I notice everything, the way I can't stop noticing, that the thin white scar along his jaw was on the wrong side. It should have been nothing. It was nothing for about 4 seconds, the length of one of my mother's held-back truths, and then it wasn't nothing, because I have a memory for faces the way some people have a memory for music, and I could see it clearly, a memory from freshman year orientation. Eli Marsh sitting 3 rows ahead of me in the auditorium, laughing at something, the afternoon light catching a thin, pale line just under his left ear. The scar in front of me now sat under his right ear. "You're staring," Eli said, and smiled the smile that undid me every single time, and I laughed it off, because that's what you do. That's what you do when the alternative is admitting that you might be the kind of person whose brain makes things up. And I already had a hole in my head where 6 months used to live. I wasn't about to hand it a second one. "Sorry," I said. "You just look, I don't know, different tonight. Different bad, different. I meant it as a joke. It came out sounding like the truth because it was." He reached over and tucked a piece of hair behind my ear, slow, deliberate, his thumb grazing my cheekbone for half a second longer than it needed to. And every rational thought in my head went quiet and soft the way it always did when he touched me like that. That was the other thing about Eli. He could turn off my noticing. He was the only thing in my life powerful enough to make the counting stop. "I'm exactly the same," he said low, and something underneath the words sounded almost like an apology, though I wouldn't understand that until much later. Wouldn't understand that the boy sitting in my desk chair that night was telling me the truth and a lie in the same 6 words, and didn't know yet which one he wanted more. I let it go. That's the part I have to be honest about if I'm going to tell this right. I let 100 small wrong things go over the following months, because letting them go was so much easier than what it would have cost me to keep pulling on the thread. I let it go when he didn't recognize the song that was supposedly ours. The one from his kitchen, the one he'd apparently danced badly to with me. I played 4 bars of it in the car in November and watched his face do nothing at all. A blankness so brief I told myself I'd imagined it, before he laughed and said of course he knew it. He was just distracted. I let it go when my mother came home from a fundraiser in December smelling like white wine and gratitude, and pressed a kiss to the top of my head with a warmth I didn't fully understand, murmuring something about how good I was doing, how proud Dr. Lindqvist was, a name I filed away without asking about because asking about things had started, somewhere in that year, to feel dangerous in a way I couldn't name. I let it go when I found the name tag. It was February by then, one of those flat grey afternoons where the cold gets into your teeth, and I was looking for a stapler in the drawer of my mother's home office, which is the kind of small domestic errand that changes a life more often than anyone likes to admit. Under a stack of tax folders was a lanyard, the plastic sleeve gone cloudy with age, a name printed in that particular sans serif font that nonprofits love, the kind of font designed to look trustworthy. Halcyon Project Guest, Client 14 no name. Just a number and underneath it in smaller type, a line I read 3 times without it meaning anything to me at all. Continuity and companion care. I put it back exactly where I found it. I told myself it was probably nothing. A fundraiser my mother had gone to, a school program. One of the 100 vaguely clinical-sounding things adults sign teenagers up for after something goes wrong in their lives, and everyone's too polite to say the word trauma out loud. I found my stapler. I went back to my homework. I did not think about it again for weeks or told myself I didn't, which is not quite the same thing. But I want you to hold on to that lanyard the way I eventually had to. Client 14, not my name. A number in a stack of paperwork my mother kept where I wasn't supposed to look. Filed under continuity and companion care. Sitting 3 feet from a boy who knocked on my window 3 times a week with a scar that had sometime, switched sides of his face. And a girl who was too busy being grateful for the one steady thing in a year full of holes to ask herself the only question that mattered. What exactly was I the client of? I didn't ask it that February. I wouldn't let myself ask it for months. But it was already inside me by then, small and patient, the way the truest questions always are, waiting for enough small wrong things to pile up around it before it finally made me look. I want to be precise about how it happened, because precision is the only gift I have to give you here, the only thing I can offer in place of an easy answer. It did not happen all at once. It happened the way water gets into a foundation. Slow, unnoticed, finding the smallest cracks first and widening them so gradually that you don't understand the house is unsound until the day you step onto a floor and feel it give. March brought the cologne. That's a strange thing to build a chapter of your life around, I know, but grief and love make you strange, and so does love that has started without your permission to feel like grief's identical twin. Eli had always smelled like cedar and something faintly sweet underneath it, like the inside of an old bookstore, and I had loved it the unthinking way you love the smell of your own pillow. And then one Tuesday in March he pulled me against him in the school parking lot, my cold hands tucked up under his jacket the way I always did, and the smell was wrong. Not bad, just wrong. Clean and sharp and citrus forward, a smell that belonged to a stranger's laundry detergent. New soap, he said before I'd even asked, which should have told me something all on its own, the answer arriving half a beat too fast, too smooth, like a line rehearsed in a mirror. My mom switched brands. I said that made sense. I said it because saying anything else meant opening the door I had promised myself I wouldn't open, not yet, not until I had something more solid to stand on than a scar that moved, and a song that didn't land, and a smell that had quietly become someone else's. But I started keeping a list. Not on paper, paper felt too permanent, too much like admitting I thought something was actually wrong with me, or with him, or with the both of us stitched together. I kept it in the voice memo app, buried 3 folders deep, labeled with a name boring enough that I hoped I'd never have to explain it to anyone. Small stuff. I'd talk into my phone at midnight with the door shut and the lamp off, my voice low enough that it barely disturbed the dark. Doesn't know the song. Scar wrong side, Act 14. Cologne changed, no explanation that tracks. Didn't remember the raccoon story. I'd told it twice by then. The one about the raccoon that got into my grandmother's porch the summer I was 12. A story I was positive I'd told Eli before, and both times his face had done that same blank half-second flicker, like a television catching static between channels, before he laughed in exactly the right place. I noticed too, once I started really watching for it, that other people did the flicker as well. Small things. Devon Ruiz, who sat behind Eli in AP Lit, called him man instead of by name for the entire month of March, which I told myself meant nothing, except that Devon had known Eli since middle school and had never once in 3 years of overlapping classes called him anything but Marsh. Miss Alvarez, our guidance counselor, stopped by our table at the spring assembly and said, "Eli, good to see you again," with a strange emphasis on again that made the back of my neck go cold, though I couldn't have told you why not then. I told myself I was the common variable in all of it. That's the cruelest trick a traumatized brain plays on you. It convinces you that you are the unreliable instrument, that the world is a fixed and steady thing, and you are the one drifting out of tune with it. I had a hole in my memory shaped like 6 months I could not account for. Why wouldn't I be the one making mistakes? Why wouldn't I be the one hearing songs wrong and misremembering scars and getting confused about which stories I'd told to which people? It felt safer to distrust myself than to distrust the one person who had never, not once, made me feel like the hole in my head disqualified me from being loved. That was the thing about him, about Eli, about whichever version of Eli was sitting across from me on any given week, though I wouldn't understand that phrasing for months yet. He was extraordinary at making me feel choseable. He'd catch my hand under the cafeteria table during the worst parts of AP testing season and press his thumb slow along my knuckles, not saying anything, just anchoring me back down into my body while I panicked about a chemistry final. He'd show up outside my last class on the days he somehow always knew were bad days. I never told anyone which days were the bad days. I barely admitted them to myself, with 2 coffees and an expression that said he'd stand there as long as it took. He looked at me like solving me was the only project he'd ever cared about finishing. There was a night in late March I still think about more than almost any other night in this whole story, because it was the closest he came, for a long time, to telling me the truth outright, and the closest I came to understanding that some enormous, careful, deliberate machinery was operating just beneath the surface of my life. We were on the Water Tower Hill, the one from the story he'd given me, the one I still couldn't remember living myself but had absorbed so thoroughly it felt like mine. It was cold enough that our breath showed, and he had his jacket around my shoulders and his arm around the jacket, and for a long time neither of us said anything, which was one of the things I loved most about him, how much silence he could hold without needing to fill it. "Can I ask you something?" he said finally, and something in his voice had gone very careful, the way a person sounds when they're testing the ice before they put their full weight on it. "Always, if you found out I'd been lying to you, about something big, something I thought I had a good reason for." He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the lights of the town spread out below us, small and steady and utterly unaware of either of us. "Would you rather I told you, even if it wrecked everything? Or would you rather not know?" My heart did something complicated and fast. "That's not a hypothetical question, is it?" "It's not a hypothetical question," he said, which was such a strange, evasive, careful sentence that I laughed despite myself, and he laughed too, but his laugh had an edge on it I hadn't heard before, something close to panic wearing the mask of a joke. "I'd want to know," I told him, because it was true, because I have never in my life wanted the comfortable version of anything over the real one, even when the real one costs more. Whatever it is, I'd rather know and be furious than not know and be, I don't know, happy on a lie. He was quiet for a long time after that, long enough that I turned to look at him and found him already looking at me, an expression on his face I didn't have a word for yet, something between grief and hunger, and a decision being made and unmade in real time. "Okay," he said so quietly I almost lost it to the wind. "Okay, I hear you." He didn't tell me anything that night. I want to be honest about that, because it would be a better story if he had, if this were the moment the truth cracked open under the stars on a hill that belonged to a version of me I couldn't remember. But it isn't that kind of story, not yet. He kissed my temple instead, long and slow. his mouth against my skin like he was trying to leave a message there in a language I hadn't learned. And then he pulled back and made a joke about my nose being cold, and the moment closed over like water. But I filed it. Everything in that conversation, the careful hypothetical, the panic under the joke, the way he'd said if I found out, not if I told you, as though the discovery might happen without him. I filed it next to the scar and the song and the cologne, and the pile was getting too big to keep pretending it was nothing. It was Mara Voss who cracked the next piece open, though she didn't mean to, and didn't understand what she'd done until much later, when I finally explained the whole thing to her over a milkshake at the diner that replaced the one that closed, and she went pale enough that I had to talk her through breathing exercises like I was the one who'd had 4 years of therapy instead of her. Mara had been my best friend since middle school, one of the only people who'd known me both before and after the accident, and she had the specific, loyal bluntness of someone who loves you enough to say the thing everyone else is too careful to say. We were at her house in April, painting our nails on her bedroom floor with the window open and pollen drifting gold through the last of the afternoon light, and she said, apropos of almost nothing, "Do you ever think it's weird that Eli's like different around finals?" Different how? I don't know. Quieter, like I saw him in the hallway before the AP bio exam and he didn't even say hi to me, and normally he's like annoyingly friendly, you know. And then like 2 days later he was back to being chatty Eli. She shrugged, focused on her thumbnail. Probably just stressed. Forget I said anything. I didn't forget. I went home that night and pulled up my calendar, the one on my phone that logged everything with the compulsive precision of someone who needs the world to hold still, and I cross-referenced it against every week I'd noted in my voice memos. And there it was, staring back at me in a pattern so clean it made my stomach drop straight through the floor. Every disappearance, every time Eli went quiet, cancelled plans, texted less, came back a few days later slightly wrong in some small unplaceable way, lined up with the exact weeks Devon Ruiz had started calling him man, or Miss Alvarez had said good to see you again, or the cologne had changed, or the scar had migrated. He wasn't disappearing randomly. He was disappearing on a schedule. I did what I do, what I have always done, since I was small enough to line up my stuffed animals by height and correct my mother's grocery list for inefficient routing through the store. I built a document. I know how that sounds. I know it sounds like the beginning of the part of the story where everyone starts to worry about the narrator's grip on reality, and honestly, for about 2 weeks in April, I worried about it myself. But I built a timeline anyway, dates down one side, observations down the other, and by the 3rd week of April the pattern had a shape so distinct it stopped being paranoia and started being research. I went to my mother with it. I want you to understand how much that cost me, because by April I had already absorbed, without ever being told outright, that the hole in my memory and the year around it were subjects that lived behind glass in our house, visible, acknowledged, never touched. I sat down across from her at the kitchen island on a Sunday afternoon while my father was at the hardware store, and I said, as evenly as I could manage, "Mom, who is Dr. Lindqvist?" She didn't answer for 4 seconds. I counted. 4 seconds exactly, the length that always meant she was deciding how much of the truth I could survive. "She's a specialist," my mother said finally, folding a dish towel that did not need folding. "She helped us after the accident, with your recovery." "What kind of specialist?" "Trauma," she said too quickly. "Memory. It's complicated, Wren, and it's not. I don't think it's helpful to relitigate all of that right now when you're doing so well. What's the Halcyon Project?" I watched something move behind her eyes, fast and involuntary, gone before I could name it. "Where did you hear that?" "Does it matter?" "It's a non-profit," she said, and her voice had gone into the register she used for reading instructions off medicine bottles, flat and careful and rehearsed. They provide support services. For families like ours, that's all it is, sweetheart. Support. Support for what exactly? For you getting better, she said, and there was something underneath it that I didn't understand yet but would never forget, not just love, though there was plenty of that, but fear, real fear, old and worn smooth with handling. The fear of a woman who has made a devastating bargain and cannot take it back, and is terrified every single day that the bargain is coming due. That's all I want, I just want you to keep getting better. She wouldn't say anything else. I pushed, gently and then not so gently, and she got up and ran the tap and told me she loved me in a voice that was trying very hard not to shake. And I understood, sitting there at the island with my useless timeline folded in my lap, that I had reached the edge of what my family was capable of telling me, and that if I wanted the rest of it, I was going to have to go and find it myself. So I did. It took me most of May. The Halcyon project turned out to be almost aggressively unsearchable. A website with 3 pages of soft focus stock photography and language so vague, it could have described anything from grief counseling to yoga retreats. A registered address that turned out to be a converted Victorian house on the quiet end of Birchwood Avenue. A phone number that rang through to a voicemail box that was always, conveniently, full. I drove past the house twice before I worked up the nerve to actually park across the street and watch it, feeling like a criminal, feeling like the version of myself I didn't recognize, the girl who used to just trust things. The 3rd time, near the end of May, I watched Kyan Marsh, Eli, walk up the front steps of that house at 7 in the evening, with his shoulders set in a way I had never once seen them set around me, tight and formal, like a soldier reporting somewhere he didn't want to report. He didn't knock, he had a key. I sat in my car for 40 minutes, long enough for the streetlights to come on, long enough for my hands to stop shaking and start again for a different reason. And then, because I have never once in my life been able to leave a question unanswered when the answer was sitting right there in front of me, I got out of the car, crossed the street, and let myself in through a side gate that led to a garden, because the Halcyon project, for all its careful vagueness, had apparently never anticipated a client's daughter breaking into its own back windows. I found the light of an office window I could see into if I stood on an overturned flower pot, and I looked through the gap in the blinds, and what I saw rearranged everything I thought I understood about the last year and a half of my life so completely that I had to press my hand over my own mouth to keep from making a sound. There were 2 of them. Kyan, my Eli, sitting rigid in a chair across from a woman I recognized instantly, without ever having met her, from the softness and control in her voice, the kind of voice that had clearly spent years talking people down off ledges both literal and otherwise. Dr. Lindqvist, 50-something, silver-streaked hair pulled back, a manila folder open on her lap, and beside Kyan, a boy I had never seen before in my life, 17 or 18, dark-haired, watching Kyan with the intense, faintly desperate focus of someone trying to memorize a role. Again, Dr. Lindqvist said. The knock, Kyan demonstrated. Knuckle, 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 a half-second apart against the arm of his chair, his face utterly blank in a way I had never seen it, professional, exhausted. The new boy copied it. Knuckle, knuckle, knuckle. Softer, Kyan said, and his voice in that moment talking to another boy about how to knock on my window, had none of the warmth it had every single time he'd used it on me. It was flat, instructional. She sleeps light in the fall, less so by spring, you'll learn her rhythms. And the new boy hesitated, glanced at his folder. The song, if she plays it, you won't know it, don't fake it. She's testing for that specifically now, we think. She's gotten sharper about testing for it, actually, which is a documentation item. I flagged it last session. He said it so clinically. Documentation item, like I was a system with a bug in it. If she asks, you say you're distracted, don't overcorrect. I don't remember walking back to my car. I remember sitting in the driver's seat with the engine off for a long time, my whole body gone strange and distant, watching my own hands like they belonged to someone else, and I remember thinking, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful in its total devastation, I am not crazy. Every terrible thing I have suspected about my own mind for the last 8 months is true, and it is so much worse than I let myself imagine, because it was never my mind that was broken. It was everyone else's carefully built machine, running underneath my whole life, and I had just found the seam. I confronted him 3 nights later on a Thursday, because I could not carry it alone for one more day without coming apart at some structural point I wasn't willing to find out about. He came to my window at 11, 3 knocks, and I let him in the way I always did, and I watched his face do the thing it always did when he saw me, soften, open, something in him visibly settling like coming home, and I hated in that moment how much that softening still worked on me even now, even with everything I knew. I followed you to Birchwood Avenue, I said, before he'd even fully climbed through, before he could touch me and turn my brain back into something warm and useless. I know about the Halcyon project. I know you're not the only one. I watched you teach some other boy how to knock on my window like a soldier being handed my life off in a briefing. I have never, before or since, watched a person's face fall apart so completely and so silently. He didn't deny it. That was almost the worst part. Some small, exhausted, animal part of me had been braced for him to deny it, to gaslight me, to give me one more careful, too smooth answer that would let me climb back into the comfortable lie for a few more months. He didn't. He sat down on the edge of my bed like his legs had simply stopped working, put his head in his hands, and when he finally spoke, his voice had none of Eli's warmth in it at all. It was younger, rawer. It was, I understood later, the first time I had ever actually heard him. My name isn't Eli, he said. It's Kyan. I stood very still by the window, the cold night air still coming through it, and I said, Then who is Eli? He's my brother, Kyan said, and his voice broke clean in half on the word, and I understood before he said one more sentence that whatever was coming next was going to take the floor out from under both of us at once. Eli was my brother. He's Wren, he died, in the accident, the one you were in, the one you don't remember. I want to tell you that I remembered it right then in a rush, the way memory is supposed to work in the movies, a flood of images arriving all at once to fill in the door that had never opened. It didn't happen like that. It happened slower and worse, a handful of true things arriving one at a time, each one landing like a stone dropped into still water, the ripples of it moving out through everything I thought I knew about myself. I was driving, I said. It wasn't a question. Some part of me had known it the second he said the word accident in that broken voice, had known it the way you know the ending of a sentence before the person finishes saying it. It was me. I was driving the car. Kyan didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice had gone very quiet, very careful, the voice of someone handling something that could still shatter. There was ice on the overpass by Route 9. You'd both left the fall formal early. You were fighting, I think, something small. I never got the full story. Nobody ever got the full story because you didn't remember it, and Eli was, he stopped. Started again. The car went off the road at the curve by the reservoir. You were unconscious for 6 minutes before anyone found you. Eli wasn't. He held on for 11 days in the ICU, and then he didn't. The room went very strange around the edges, the way it does right before you faint, though I didn't faint, I just stood there, holding onto the windowsill, feeling the whole architecture of the last 18 months rearrange itself into a shape I didn't recognize as my own life. Everyone let me believe he moved away, I said. You asked in the hospital over and over, before your memory of that spring came back at all. You kept asking where Eli was, why he hadn't visited, and every time you asked it was like watching you find out for the first time. Your mother said the doctors called it a loop, that you couldn't hold onto the loss long enough to grieve it, that every time the truth reached you, your brain closed the door again to protect you, over and over, dozens of times, and each time it happened it did something to you that scared everyone half to death. This look you'd get, this blankness, like something behind your eyes was going out. His hands were shaking now, I noticed, though his voice had steadied into something almost rehearsed, like a story he had told himself so many times in the mirror that it had worn smooth. Dr. Lindqvist had worked with a handful of families before, teenagers who lost someone the same way, sudden, violent, entangled with their own culpability. Memory that wouldn't hold the shape of the truth no matter how gently people tried to give it to them. Her theory was that some griefs can't be delivered all at once, that you had to build a bridge across it instead, something steady enough to hold your weight while the ground underneath got safe enough to walk on again. So they built you. They built Eli, he said, and something in the correction landed like a blow, though I understood later that it was the truest sentence he said to me that whole night. A version of him. Consistent, gentle, endlessly patient, filling in the parts of that spring you couldn't remember with a story soft enough not to break you. A boy who was always going to be there, because loss was the one thing your mind couldn't survive twice. They found actors, trained them, rotated them every few months so no single person had to carry the whole weight of pretending to be a dead boy forever, and between rotations they used guided sessions, half memory therapy, half something closer to hypnosis. I don't fully understand the science of it myself, to smooth the transitions so you never consciously clocked the handoff. You were never supposed to notice, Wren. Nobody accounted for how much you notice. I laughed then, one short broken sound that didn't have any humor in it at all. And you? Where do you fit into a rotation of strangers? He looked at me for a long moment before he answered, and when he did, his voice had lost every trace of performance in it, scraped down to something raw and true. I volunteered 8 months ago. I'd seen him, my brother, turned into a role that other boys wore for money, strangers reading his mannerisms off a file, and I couldn't stand it, the idea of someone else being the last version of him you ever loved. So I told Dr. Lindqvist I wanted the rotation. I told myself it was for him, that I was protecting what was left of Eli by being the one who played him. He dragged a hand down his face. It was never just that. You have to understand, I loved you before the accident too. From a distance, the way a little brother loves the girl his brother brings home, quiet and useless and never meant to go anywhere. And then I was standing in your bedroom every week wearing my brother's name and watching you fall in love with him again. Except it wasn't him. It was me the whole time. And somewhere in the last 8 months I stopped being able to tell where the performance ended and I began. I broke every rule they gave me. I answered questions I was scripted to deflect. I let you see the cracks because some reckless, terrible part of me wanted you to catch me. I am not supposed to feel anything real for a client. I have felt everything real for you since October. I didn't say anything for a long time. Outside, the wind moved through the tree by my window, the same tree that had hidden 100 sets of 3 careful knocks, and I found myself doing the thing I do, the thing I have always done, counting, trying to find the shape of the danger, except this time there was no clean number to land on, no 4 seconds that told me how much truth I could survive, because I had just survived all of it at once and I was, somehow, still standing. I need to see her, I said finally. Lindqvist. Tonight. My mother found us in the kitchen an hour later, Kyan and me sitting at the island where she'd folded that dish towel so carefully in April. and I watched her face go through every stage of a controlled collapse: fear, then a terrible relief, like a woman finally setting down something impossibly heavy, then fear again, because setting it down didn't mean the weight was gone, it just meant it was mine to carry now too. "You know," I said, not a question. "I approved it," she said, and her voice cracked wide open on the word approved, 18 months of held-together composure finally giving way at once. God help me, Wren. I sat in a room with that woman 4 months after the funeral, and watched you ask for the 11th time that week why Eli hadn't called, watched that light go out of your eyes again. And she told me there was a way to buy you time to heal instead of shattering over and over, and I said yes. I would say yes again. I don't know how to tell you I'm sorry in a way that's big enough. Dr. Lindqvist came to the house at midnight because my mother called her, because apparently that was a number she had memorized the way other mothers memorize a pediatrician's. She was smaller in person than she'd looked through the office blinds, silver hair loose now instead of pinned back, and she sat across from me at our kitchen table with the same careful, clinical warmth I'd watched her use on Kyan 3 nights earlier. And she did not apologize, not once, not really. And I have thought about that more than almost anything else since. "I want you to understand what I'm about to tell you isn't a threat," she said. "It's a fact, and I owe you the fact even though I know you won't want it. What you experienced tonight, the sudden, total confrontation with a loss your mind has spent 18 months refusing to hold, carries real risk. We've seen it before in earlier cases, before we developed the continuity protocol. Dissociative episodes, in 2 instances hospitalization. The gradual method exists because the sudden method nearly cost a 17-year-old boy his life 4 years ago, and I built an entire program around never letting that happen to another kid again." She folded her hands on the table, and for the first time her composure had a crack of something almost like grief in it. "I can offer you a reset. A guided session tonight, tomorrow at the latest. We ease the acute trauma of this confrontation back under, rebuild the continuity, let you keep healing the way you have been for the last 1.5 years, steadily, safely, on a timeline your mind can actually survive. You would not remember this conversation. You would not remember what Kyan told you. You would keep the version of this year that's been working." The kitchen was very quiet. Kyan beside me had gone rigid, his jaw tight, and I understood he was leaving the choice entirely to me, refusing to weight it with a single word, which was its own kind of answer. "And if I say no," I said. "Then we do it the hard way," Dr. Lindqvist said simply. "Together, carefully, with real support instead of scaffolding, and I won't pretend to you that it's not going to be brutal for a while. Grief you've been protected from for 18 months doesn't arrive gently, just because you finally asked for it honestly." I thought about the lanyard in my mother's drawer. Client 14, no name, just a number, filed under continuity and companion care, and how small that had made me feel without my even understanding why at the time. I thought about every version of Eli who had climbed through that window, real boys with real lives who had been paid to memorize my sadness and hand it back to me in a shape I could survive, and about the fact that not one of them, in 18 months, had been permitted to let me actually grieve. "I don't want the reset," I said, and my voice only shook a little. "I've spent 1.5 years being protected from my own life. I would rather have the real one, even the parts that break something in me for a while. I get to choose that, it's mine to choose." Dr. Lindqvist looked at me for a long moment, and something in her face, not quite defeat, something closer to respect, hard-won and unwilling, settled into place. "Then we'll do it carefully," she said. "Starting tonight. I won't tell you the next several weeks were easy, because that would be its own kind of lie, and I've had enough of those to last a lifetime. Grief that arrives 18 months late doesn't know how to be gentle about the delay. There were nights I couldn't get out of bed, Days I cried in the parking lot before first period until the bell had already rung twice. A specific unbearable afternoon in June when I finally let myself look at photographs of the real Eli Marsh, dark-eyed, quick-smiling, a scar under his left ear from a bike accident at 9 years old, and grieved a boy I had loved and lost twice, once in a car on an icy overpass and once again, slower, in a version of myself that had been kept from knowing it. Kyan left the Halcyon Project the same week. He told Dr. Lindqvist he couldn't keep wearing his brother's name for other families after wearing it for mine, and she let him go without argument, which I think was its own quiet form of apology. He didn't disappear. That's the part I hold on to. On the nights the grief gets loud again, he didn't disappear. He just stopped knocking 3 times on my window in the dark, and started knocking once in the daylight at my front door under his own name, asking if I wanted to go for a walk as exactly and only himself. It's October again as I'm telling you this. A full year since the night I noticed a scar on the wrong side of a face I thought I knew completely. And Kyan is teaching himself, slowly, what it means to be loved for the boy he actually is instead of the ghost he spent a year performing. We don't have our song the way Eli and I supposedly did, the one he never recognized because he'd never once heard it. Instead, we found a new one this summer, a stupid, slow song that came on the radio during a long drive with the windows down, and I watched his face light up recognizing it in real time, unrehearsed, unscripted, entirely his. And I have never loved anything the way I loved that ordinary, unremarkable proof that he was real. Somewhere in the middle of that brutal, necessary June, I finally sat down and listened back through every voice memo I'd recorded in the dark over the previous year. The whole buried folder of them, start to finish in one sitting, with a cup of tea going cold beside me and my hands wrapped so tight around my phone my knuckles ached. It took almost 2 hours. I had forgotten how many there were, dozens of small, patient, half-whispered observations, a girl in the dark building a case file out of a scar, and a song and a smell refusing, months before she had a single answer, to let herself be talked out of what she was noticing. Listening to it felt like watching someone else's courage from a safe distance. I kept waiting for the version of me on the recording to give up, to decide she was imagining things, to let the easier story win, and she never did. Not once. She just kept counting, quietly, patiently, until the pile of small wrong things got too heavy for anyone to keep explaining away. One memory came back to me that same week, unprompted, arriving the way Dr. Lindqvist had warned me true grief sometimes arrives, sideways, without permission, in the middle of an ordinary afternoon. I was standing at the kitchen sink rinsing a mug when I heard it, not saw it, just heard it, clear as if it were happening in the next room. Eli's voice, the real one, a half-octave higher than Kyan's, laughing at something I'd said in the car right before the world went sideways on the overpass by the reservoir. I don't remember what the joke was. I don't think I ever will. But I remember that he was laughing, that the last true thing I have of him is the sound of him happy, and some nights that's a wound and other nights, slowly, it's starting to be a gift instead, and I've stopped expecting to know in advance which one it's going to be when I wake up. I still count things. I don't think that will ever fully leave me, and I've stopped wanting it too. It's the thing that saved me in the end, the stubborn, noticing part of my mind that refused to accept a comfortable story over a true one, even when the true one cost so much more. I count the seconds before my mother answers hard questions, and they're getting shorter now, closer to 0, because we don't keep things behind glass in our house anymore. I count the knocks when Kyan comes to the door, and it's never 3 anymore, and some evenings the difference in that single missing knock is the most beautiful sound I have ever heard. If you take one thing from this, and I've told it to you slowly on purpose, because I think some truths only make sense if you're given the chance to notice them arriving the way I had to notice them arriving, one small wrongness at a time. Let it be this. The people who love you the most sometimes decide without asking you how much of your own life you're allowed to carry. It comes from love. I believe that even now, even knowing everything it cost me. But it isn't theirs to decide. It was never theirs to decide. It was always supposed to be mine,